Hello everyone, and welcome to this Stronger Together series. We've been running these sessions for a number of months now, and given how much things have changed over this period, the context to my introductions have been different for each session. When the series kicked off with presentations from Bruce and Paul, we were in the very early stages of the global health crisis, and the unknowns certainly dwarfed the knowns. In the period since, we've experienced profound restrictions on the movements of both people and goods, sectors going into complete shutdown, and normal economic activity being severely impacted across a huge number of industries and geographies. For us here at De Beers, the events over the last few months have resulted in us seeking to adapt and introduce initiatives designed to both protect our business and that of our partners in the industry. These measures have varied from providing extensive flexibility for our rough diamond customers to the launch of the new De Beers Group Auction Sales Buy platform, which gives registered buyers the opportunity to purchase polished diamonds 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it is our approach to developing initiatives that is the topic for today's session. We will shortly hear from Neil Ventura, De Beers Group Executive Vice President for Strategy and Innovation. He is going to discuss how De Beers Group encourages and promotes innovative ideas using our Ignite platform, and then detail the process that is undertaken to assess and prioritise these ideas. Neil will also cover our approach to working with colleagues to develop and evolve those ideas, and how, with these, we try and replicate the spirit of a startup. We will also hear from Neil why uncertain times such as those that we are currently experiencing are an ideal time to explore innovations and make improvements to accepted ways of doing things, which I'm sure you will agree is extremely timely. As David said at the top of the event, as with our previous events, following Neil's presentation, we will run a question and answer session. You can, as always, submit these questions now and throughout the time we remain live and on air. And we're happy to answer questions which relate directly to Neil's presentation, or if there are any specific for me to answer that relate more to the midstream. To submit these, please do so via the Q&A facility on your screen. Now, in previous sessions, due to the large number of questions that we have received, we've not been able to answer all within the broadcast, but we will do what we can to answer as many as possible. I want to finish by highlighting that despite still being in the midst of a global health crisis, there are signs that things are beginning to improve in a number of places. However, it is vital that we all remain vigilant and remember all the significant sacrifices we have made to get to this point. I do suspect that we still have a bumpy road ahead, but if we continue to stand together, it is also my sincere belief that we will, as an industry, emerge stronger and more resilient. Thank you once again for joining us today, and it's now my pleasure to hand over to Neil.
Thanks very much, Bernard, and hey everyone, welcome indeed to this Stronger Together series session. I'm speaking to you this evening from home here in Singapore. I've been working from home now for the last 3.5 months and observing the circuit breaker measures here that the Singapore government has imposed as we try and flatten the curve on what is a second wave. I think given the way that things are unfolding, I'm looking at least several more weeks before any possible return to the office. So that will take me well past the 4-month mark. And if I think back to the outset of 2020, back in January, I couldn't possibly have envisaged that I'd be spending the majority of the first half of the year working from home. Quite extraordinary circumstances, really unprecedented times. I think we're all starting to run out of superlatives really to describe the situation that we find ourselves living through, working through, and adapting to on a daily and weekly basis. And really just starting to turn to the theme of today's discussion, innovation in turbulent times. I think in many ways we're all participating in experimentation at an unprecedented global scale. You know, we really are seeing in each of the countries in which we operate and live, the country governments essentially running tests and experiments to really learn and discover how best to flatten the curve in each of the jurisdictions in question, share learning across geographies where relevant to do so, so that collectively everyone can beat this thing and get on top of the virus. So just unprecedented scale of experimentation really all around us. I really have three main aims for talking to you today about innovation in De Beers. I think the first of those is actually really just to share with you how we think about and approach innovation in De Beers. To my knowledge, it's not really something that we've ever really spoken to an audience like this about. We've often tended to focus perhaps on specific innovation initiatives, but I'm not sure we've ever really spoken to you about the overall approach that we tend to take, an approach that's starting to serve us well throughout the cycle and that we're persevering with through times like these. I think in doing that and sharing that information, I hope there's something of interest for everyone. I think for those of you that are well established on your own innovation journeys, your own corporate innovation journeys, hopefully there'll be something of interest here that will further reinforce what you're already doing. I think if you're just setting out, perhaps what I'll share with you can provide some good foundational pointers that might be of use to you in your own businesses. And perhaps if you're somewhere in between, then what I'll share might hold some useful pointers as to how you move forward and evolve. And really the third aim that I wanted to get to today is really something of a call to action. I think in keeping with the name of this series, Stronger Together, I think it's always important, but I think it's particularly important now that we find new ways to work together and to come together. So I've got a couple of calls to action that I'll perhaps end with during the wrap up. So turning first to how we think about and approach innovation in De Beers, I think perhaps the best place to start is explaining how we think about the innovation imperative. Why is innovation actually important? I think throughout the cycle, we see it as key to advancing our business on a number of fronts, to making progress as a business. But in times like these, we feel it's especially important. You know, I think on previous sessions, Paul, for example, has often referred to the VUCA world that we live in, a world that's more volatile, more uncertain, more complex, and more ambiguous. And I think in uncertain times, innovation is rising more and more to the fore. That's certainly the approach that we look at through De Beers. And if I double click on the U for uncertainty really in that VUCA acronym, then I think the more uncertain the environment, the more it's important to adopt some of the tools of innovation through testing and learning and experimentation to try and find the right pathway for the business forward during these very difficult times. So in short, I think the innovation imperative is important throughout the cycle, but as the uncertainty rises, even more important. And I think pre-COVID, we had plenty of uncertainty in the world all around us. I think it's fair to say that as COVID has come along, those levels of uncertainty have really been ratcheted up to a whole new level, making innovation more important than ever. Maybe before I get into the actual approach that we take to innovation in De Beers, it's important to sort of land a definition that we can think about as we have this discussion. The one we increasingly coalesce around really is this notion of how do you take ideas, it could be new process ideas, it could be new product and service innovation ideas, increasingly it could be new business model ideas, and how do you take those ideas through to impact? Maybe if I double click on that definition a little bit, I think it's important that I can sort of tease out a few things that are going on with that definition. I think firstly, we have different types of innovation that we're busy with, and there's a clue there in that definition. We look at a fairly comprehensive definition that encompasses, as I say, process innovation, innovation around new products, new service offerings, and increasingly new business models, for example, Lightbox, Tracer, GemFair. So it covers a fairly broad span of innovation. That definition of taking ideas to impact also speaks to the activity itself, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And the definition also talks to impact. I think innovation increasingly is all about impact, typically financial, but other forms of impact as well. And I think that impact point is really important. What we're not talking about really in the way that we approach innovation is, lots of people running around with sticky notes and Sharpies and sipping cafe lattes all day on beanbags. Nothing wrong with any of those things, by the way, but on their own, they won't add up to much in terms of impact. So innovation with impact is really key. So that's a little bit about the innovation imperative. That's a little bit about how we think about innovation in terms of a definition. And so starting to drift into how we approach innovation in a more practical sense in De Beers, I think the first thing to introduce is the umbrella term or name that we use to describe our approach to innovation. And that's shown here on the screen. De Beers Group Ignite is the umbrella term that we give to our innovation efforts. Within Ignite, we cover off a broad range of innovation activities. So, for example, we undertake fundamental research. It could be research, for example, into synthetic diamonds. We undertake the incubation of promising technologies that we think can improve the performance of some of our key activities in our current business. We incubate promising new business models as well. And in addition to that, we also have a venturing arm. And I think one of the things we've learned is that it's impossible to have all the ideas yourself internally. Impossible that we could do that in De Beers. Not a good undertaking to even try. And so really through venturing, what we're looking to do is to engage with the amazing world of startups and different geographies who typically are working on a dedicated basis with talented teams, trying to develop tech solutions to problems that we think might be around the corner or coming at us over the horizon further down the field. And it's provided a very nice complement to a lot of our internal innovation activities. So within De Beers Group Ignite, quite a spread of different innovation activities. Also within De Beers Group Ignite, we've developed and continue to refine and evolve a fairly comprehensive framework and approach to innovation. And I want to spend the time walking you through that and sharing that with you, really to fulfill the aims that I set out at the beginning of this discussion. I think the simplest way to think about the Ignite framework is really to divide it into two main parts. So the first part is really about the what. And that's essentially an innovation portfolio discussion that I'll come on to in just a second. And the second aspect to it is really a ways of working. How do we practically approach innovation in its various forms? And in that, I'll touch upon various aspects from the process that we use to take these ideas through to impact, how we think about measuring innovation, often quite tough to do, but very important. How do we think about funding innovation in ways that are useful to innovation activities and different from the way that we typically fund activities in the core, how we resource teams, and how we use experimentation quite significantly. So really just two parts that I want to walk you through now. One is that what around innovation portfolio, and the second piece will be around ways of working. So moving to portfolio, the way that we think about it looks something similar to this. Really three main aspects to innovation portfolio management as we see them and as we practice them. So firstly, in this notion of selection and prioritization, I think it stands to reason that no business can really advance all the ideas that it comes up with We certainly feel that's the case. We typically have many, many more ideas than we could possibly realistically advance. The old adage that generating ideas is relatively low cost, but acting on them can rapidly become expensive if you're not careful is definitely something that we think is true. And so you need a mechanism really to be able to select and prioritize those ideas that would make their way into an active innovation portfolio. I think in times like these, that whole process really just speeds up. It becomes more dynamic due to the sort of compression of cycle times that we're going through at the moment. And sometimes it's also necessary to repurpose or redirect certain initiatives that we may have been busy with pre-COVID. A good example of that, I think, is how we have repurposed our 3D printing capability to 3D print visors that have been used by the National Health Service in the UK as one example of how we've repurposed. So selection and prioritization, very important throughout the cycle, important now, and more of a dynamic process, I'd suggest, as we navigate through this crisis. The second big aspect of an innovation portfolio is really what we call balance. And the central challenge that we continue to grapple with is how do we strike this right balance for us between investing in innovation initiatives that speak to optimizing or improving the current core business, and how do we simultaneously advance innovation initiatives that speak to building tomorrow or some aspect of the future that we're keen to explore? And how do we do both of those things at the same time? I think for those of you that were with us at a prior business excellence seminar a few years ago, will have seen Vijay Govindarajan really bring this concept to life. He at the time used the 3-box solution that he's now quite famous for. And you may well remember that the sort of theory that he was putting forward about a balanced innovation portfolio is really reflected here in this simple visual. Vijay used to say that the challenge facing corporates as they try and innovate is really one where you have to do really 3 things at the same time. One is pursue innovation initiatives, as I say, that can help a company improve its current core business performance. But at the same time, that's really box 1 in his model. And how at the same time do you advance innovation initiatives that speak to building out the future or leaning into tomorrow, which was box 3 in his model. The 3-box solution also has box 2, very important, where really what do you take off the table so that you can make more space for your box 1 and box 3 innovation initiatives, or perhaps remove initiatives that really have lost relevance perhaps through the passage of time. Perhaps you didn't like Vijay's 3-box model. Perhaps you're more familiar with other frameworks such as the Innovation Ambition Matrix, this notion of core business innovation, more adjacent innovation, and more transformational innovation. Perhaps you're more of a fan of the McKinsey 3 Horizons model that speaks to a similar theme of investing in today, trying to pursue what's next or adjacent, and also what's further afield. It really doesn't matter. I think in our view, all of these frameworks really carry this central message of how do you find the right balance throughout any cycle appropriate to a given business that strikes this balance between optimizing today and sort of exploring the future or exploring tomorrow. Why is this important? Well, there's a growing body of evidence that suggests that those companies that become quite capable with this challenge tend to not just survive, but they actually tend to thrive, and that those that tend to just retreat to the core business tend not to do so well. And this body of evidence, as I say, is increasingly being played out across industries. Now, don't get me wrong, we're not talking about now being a time for growth, and we're certainly not suggesting that the core is not important. In fact, quite the contrary, the core is incredibly important, and in our view should dominate, and does indeed in our portfolio too, but not exclusively. So really when we think about this, we start to have a portfolio challenge question that really runs along the lines of how are we going to use this time? Are we going to navigate through this crisis really just hunkering down to the core scraping through this crisis, probably emerging with a few more scars on our back from having navigated through these incredibly challenging conditions, but basically emerging when markets recover, and they will recover, with a largely unchanged business? Or can we navigate through this crisis finding this balance so that we try and best prepare the company to be in an ideal position for when markets do indeed recover? So this aspect of portfolio balance really has a few dimensions to it that we think is incredibly important. It's something we've been increasingly applying in De Beers and continue to refine and hone as we move through these very challenging times. The other aspect to innovation portfolio management really is one of themes. And again, on this simplistic visual with different colored dots indicating different themes, we really just mean clusters of similar themed innovation activities that really speak to one common theme. And I think what we're experiencing is, and what we're witnessing is, that COVID-19 has really given us a sudden glimpse of the future. It's given us a sudden accelerated window into what's coming around the corner. And I think it's really driven all of us up the digital adoption curve almost overnight. You know, if I think about this at an individual level, I will typically be speaking to my teams on a daily basis through digital means. Here we are on this webinar. I think at an organizational level, we're seeing a rapid proliferation of digital technologies that are aiming to improve the consumer experience. I think we're seeing a proliferation of approaches to transform the customer experience through digital means. I think operationally, we're seeing more and more companies try and fast track digital technologies to connect up their supply chains and other aspects of their operation and so on and so forth. So I think COVID-19 has really fast-tracked the digital agenda for everyone, including us. And perhaps if we were looking at getting to certain digital initiatives X quarters down the track, or perhaps into next year, everything seemingly has been brought forward to be now, as we're all forced up this digital adoption curve overnight, as I say. So certainly when we think about digital as a theme in our innovation portfolio in De Beers, it features quite heavily. And maybe I can try and bring that to life a little bit for you. So for example, we will invest in technologies that we think can automate and operate in a connected way certain key activities. For example, that could be in our mining activities or in our recovery operations. It could also be through technologies that help us sort and classify rough diamonds, for example. But we've also been continuing to pursue digital technologies that can transform the consumer experience. We've been doing that through De Beers Jewelers and Forevermark businesses, for example, taking very much more of an omni-channel approach. We've also, and Bernard alluded to this in the introduction, we've also recently seen through De Beers Auction Sales the testing of their new Buy Now platform, again through digital means, providing customers with an incredibly deep data set about the products on offer, extensive visual data about the products on offer, and greater flexibility through digital means to essentially buy those products when they need them. So really, in our context, a lot of digital activity, perhaps in our core, but equally, I must also reference Tracer here. I mean, Tracer is really probably our most ambitious digital undertaking. And I think it's one thing to try and work with those different technologies the Tracer team are working with to forge a digital solution that can trace and track an unchanging physical product from mine through to point of sale. I think it's a whole nother tier of digital complexity entirely when you're trying to do that for the purposes of establishing trust, provenance, traceability, authenticity for a product that does physically transform, such as diamonds from the rough to the polished state. And it's another tier of complexity again when you're trying to do that not for a single company, but actually to kickstart an industry platform and having a solution that's scalable across industry. So whilst De Beers has started off Tracer, it's kickstarted Tracer, if you will, we don't envisage this as a De Beers platform for De Beers. We envisage this as an industry platform for industry. And I think it's one of the more significant digital initiatives that sit in this digital theme in our portfolio. So that's a bit about how we think about managing an active innovation portfolio. I think if we then move to the other aspect that's part of the Ignite framework, we start to move into a ways of working conversation. And this now speaks to really the how of innovation as we see it. How do we move these ideas from their state as an idea through to something that we hope will have impact? And a number of different things to touch upon here. I'll start perhaps with process. And within an innovation process that we've established in Ignite, we've built it up steadily over the years. We've really got a simplistic visual around how we describe this innovation process. We typically, as I say, undertake ideas, an ideation process to generate ideas. We of course can't advance all of them. So having selected which ideas to move forward with, we then move into a phase of testing. And as I'll come on to talk to you shortly, there's a lot going on in testing, heavy use of experimentation to really try and bring back evidence that we're onto something. And if we are onto something and we like what we see and we think it's worth going after with more resources, then typically we'll move out of testing and into scale, but not before we've fully validated that we're comfortable with the idea. Now, this is a very simplistic outline of the process that we follow for innovation. There's actually a lot of depth to it, a lot of depth that sits behind these simple three main stages. That toolkit has really evolved over the last couple of years, really borrowed heavily from best practices that we've seen elsewhere in the innovation space, including how we see other corporates doing it. And it's starting to increasingly be used across all parts of De Beers as a repeatable process with a common language that allows us to try and move through the gears to take an idea through the testing phases and then hopefully to a point where it can be scaled. So that's a little bit about process. I think moving on from process, we really get into some other aspects of the how of innovation. Experimentation is a really big theme that runs through the Ignite approach. I think most ideas inherently are full of uncertainty. They're full of unknowns. They're full of things that we have to assume. And so we've increasingly deployed the use of experimentation, perhaps not in the chemical sense as this image tries to portray, but definitely in the scientific sense that we will look to test those assumptions and test them in a way that can really prove whether we're onto the right path or not, as the case may be, typically with a view to getting certain data back that would allow us then to determine how we think we should move forward, armed with a bit more knowledge than we had prior to each experiment, and really running these experiments as iterative loops to really try and pathfind our way through. And I think it's important to link this back to the innovation imperative, that the more uncertain the environment, the more adopting these types of tools, these types of frameworks has proven very useful to us to try and discover the right pathway through, given all the uncertainty that's around us. So experimentation runs very heavily through the Ignite process. Moving on to another aspect of the ways of working is the need for speed. I think it's been much talked about pre-COVID that everything's accelerating, everything's getting faster. I'm always reminded when I think about this aspect by a quote by Bill Fisher, who's a professor at IMD Business School in Switzerland, and he said that our world is at its slowest and least complex today. And I find that quite a thought-provoking choice of words that always reminds me of the need for speed. the way we've tried to engineer our approach to innovation through the process flow that I briefly touched upon, through the use of experimentation, is really to move quite quickly. And I think COVID-19 has really just done one thing in this regard, and that's accelerate all the timelines. I think everything that we're seeing around us has sort of changed cadence, and a monthly meeting really is of little use in times like these. Monthlies become sort of weekly, and weeklies become daily. And so the need for speed is really everywhere. And it's certainly true in our experience of what has to work effectively for innovation to move forward. We need to take ideas quickly and economically to their logical conclusion. So speed's a big aspect. We also approach the funding of innovation activities very differently to the way that we might think about funding other initiatives, non-innovation, in De Beers. And really where this started was really just learning from how others have done it in different environments. We actually immersed ourselves in various innovation hotspots such as Silicon Valley. We've spoken to countless people, experts in their field. We've looked at how other corporates have done it. We've spoken to people that are well versed in how venture capital works, for example, and really taken all that and tried to adapt it to our own specific circumstance, adapted it really to what we think will work for us. And broadly, as you see here on this simple visual, typically a new idea would typically get a small amount of initial funding or seed funding, enough for a very small dedicated team to move forwards, try and test those ideas through heavy use of experiments. And as they bring back evidence that they're onto something, we may move through subsequent gears of funding, as shown here, sort of stage A, stage B, and so on and so forth. What we're really trying to do here is recognize and fund against the uncertainty. So at the beginning, you'll typically have very high uncertainty around a given idea. And in our view, it makes sense that we put a small amount of funding in place against that uncertainty. But as teams experiment, test and learn and bring down the uncertainty around an idea over a period of time, then we're prepared to put progressive funding behind more certain things. And clearly, by the time that a more sizable, significant investment is looking like the right thing to do, those uncertainty levels will have been very, very significantly reduced through many, many loops of testing and experimentation, essentially turning unknowns, assumptions, into facts to guide us down the pathway as to how to move forward. So this funding approach, very different for innovation initiatives to the way that we would otherwise fund initiatives. I think two more aspects to briefly touch upon in terms of the ways of working. Firstly, how we think about measuring innovation. We actually started here. We felt it really important at the outset of this Ignite journey to be very, very clear what outcomes we would be looking for, how we might measure whether an innovation is working or not working. And again, there's quite a bit of depth that sits behind this simple overview, but in essence, we really measure innovation in two main ways. We think about it through the lens of innovation activity, and we also think about it through the lens of innovation impact. On the activity side, just to try and give you a bit of an example, we would typically measure innovation activity in terms of what's been the lead time in weeks between us selecting an idea and getting that idea into market for first testing with customers. We'd also look at the costs incurred in doing the same. So speed and cost really are two aspects of the activity metric set that we use. On the impact side, as I say, it's mostly financial, but sometimes not. If it is financial, a very typical metric is one of several that we look at, and that is what are the new revenues that have been generated from new products, new services, new business models over the prior period. Could be the prior 3 years, could be the prior 5 years. And so measurements like that form part of our impact measurement set. And then perhaps just lastly, touching upon teams. We've learnt along the way that it's really important to resource innovation initiatives a bit differently. Typically, what's worked well for us is that we establish very small, dedicated teams initially, and then as initiatives start to prove out, we would build out those teams step by step. But a very, very interesting aspect of how we've resourced innovation initiatives is where innovation teams are located. If we take something like a GemFair or a Lightbox or a Tracer, or even how we incubate our technologies, in most cases, these are dedicated teams, but they are working off-site in their own premises. They don't form part of the corporate setup, the corporate headquarters. They are typically in their own dedicated spaces away from corporate headquarters, and they're typically staffed with dedicated teams, not partial or part-time teams, to really try and give focused, dedicated attention to moving each innovation idea forward. So really that's a quick run around the track in terms of many of the different ways of working. I think it's important to say that one thing that we've learned is that to really start to get an innovation framework or approach that can take hold in the organization, important to forge a common language. We've worked quite hard to do that, again, under the Ignite approach. But we've also got to put in place all the different elements. I think one early learning is that if you only have one or two of these elements, it becomes harder. And it's necessary to really put in place all of these elements so that we've got an overall repeatable, scalable process that we can apply to our innovation efforts. So, having really walked you through the what, the innovation portfolio approach that we take, and having walked you through several of the main aspects of the how, I hope I've gone some way to achieving the first of my two aims. I think in summary, the key messages that I would probably want to leave you with from these two aims are really that as the uncertainty goes up, in our view, the innovation approach becomes more important. And as we discussed, life was uncertain enough before COVID came along. It's extremely uncertain now. And I think the need to work in these ways to pathfind through this crisis for us is increasingly important. So I think that's a key takeout. I think in terms of portfolio, a few things to think about. One of the things that we continue to focus on is the selection and prioritization, but also the balance, that notion of striking the right balance of innovation initiatives that speak to optimizing our current business, but also simultaneously exploring the future. And in addition to balance, how do we think about the innovation initiatives that we're pursuing in terms of themes? And digital, I would suggest, is a big theme for us and probably for many people on this call. And I think the timelines around that are being significantly accelerated. And then I've touched upon ways of working. I've talked through process. I've talked through how we think about funding innovation initiatives differently, talked through how we measure it, how we resource it, how we use experimentation quite significantly. And I think certainly to many of the businesses on the call that are our customers, I think at some point you were all startups. And I think in times like this, these ways of working in many ways are a call to us, I think, all to sort of rekindle the startup spirit. There's so much that we can learn in terms of being fleet of foot, quick across the ground, doing things at low cost, cash preservation, obviously top of mind at the moment for us all, and so many aspects of the ways of working of startups that we try and adapt and tailor to the corporate environment. But equally, I think for many of the business customers on the call, thinking about this startup spirit and trying to sort of rekindle it where necessary is probably a useful way forward. So coming to my third aim, really just a couple of calls to action. I think in keeping with the theme of this discussion and this series of Stronger Together, I think it's increasingly important that we find new ways to work together and pull together so we can get through this crisis as in the best possible shape. I think two main calls to action. One would be Tracer. I think for many people on the call that are already engaging with Tracer, I would encourage you to continue to do that. I think it offers a great way of essentially thinking about retooling your existing business, retooling in a digital sense. And I think if we accept that the digital agenda has really come forward from the future to be upon us now, Tracer offers a fantastic opportunity to really fast track certain aspects of your own digital journeys. If you're not currently engaged with Tracer, I would encourage you to have a look at it, because I think what the team have done there is really create the platform around which many different digital agendas can flourish. So I think call to action really around Tracer. The other one would be really a more general call to action to say, how might we think about working more collaboratively across these very difficult times? In fact, straight after this webinar, I think you'll be receiving the usual survey that would focus perhaps on feedback on this session. But in addition, there's a question set that really tries to explore what's sort of the main challenges or pain points that everyone's experiencing at the moment, if they're willing to share these, and really try and use that as a basis to see if there's opportunities where we could co-ideate together. So explore potential solutions and possibly even go further and look to co-create potential solutions together further down the track. As I say, I think in times like these, we're reminded that we need to do more to see if we can be stronger together by working more closely together. So a bit of a call to action to have a look at that survey. It won't take very long to complete, but I would encourage you, if you have the time, to please do so, because if you are willing to share some of this information, it'll give us the basis to actually try and take some next steps and explore new possibilities around a common understanding of the main problem sets. So look, I think I'll end there. I hope that's allowed me to fulfill my main aims. I hope it's given you a good sense of how we think about and approach innovation in De Beers today. I hope I've brought it to life a little bit in terms of some of the more practical elements that we tend to use, both from a portfolio approach and ways of working approach. And hopefully the calls to action are clear, and that we can continue dialogue post this webinar. So I think Bernard and I are both on hand to do our best to answer any questions that you have. And I think with that in mind, we're free to go into the Q&A. Thank you.